Hello, everybody. Welcome back. This is the third lecture in chapter 1. The last one we were talking about, we got through one little box. We talked about race and ethnicity and environment and hereditary, her environment and her you know what I mean, genes. In this one, I want to talk about the role of time and toss in some cool terms, right? So if you move on to the box number 5, there's terms like normative, not normative, on time, history graded. And the reason that what these terms are about is if you think about human development, and you remember going back to the first lecture where we were talking about the goals, which included, observation, looking for patterns and intervening, what we have to know is what is considered normal or typical. So what would a healthy person's experience be? What would healthy human development look like? And just as we have these biological processes, which would be part of our our genetic processes, there's also the role of society or other people, and the significance of historical trends. In other words, what would be a typical growing up in the 70s would be different than a typical growing up in 2020. Or what would be a typical teenage experience in 1968 during Vietnam is a very unusual experience in 2008 or 2018. So there's an acknowledgement for what is a normal process, I guess we're using the word normal, what is a typical developmental process, and how that varies across time. I'm convinced that we will see that researchers have already probably begun collecting data about from children, college, children, all people, young children, people who have graduated from high school in 2020, young people who were entering college in 2020, what happened last spring in March, where everybody was pulled off campus and pulled out of schools and brought home, how that's going to influence or have affected their social development, maybe their emotional development. That is, and it's in your textbook, was referred to as a critical period. Like before you get to 25, if you remember your pre-quiz, your brain's not fully developed. And imagine, things I think about are young people, 22-year-olds who are in college, and then they're bombarded with all of this fear of catching this virus that could kill them and how that has implications. But I'm getting ahead of myself right now. Okay, so getting back to the handout. So you got some important words here. You have normative and non-normative. And what this means is typical, right? A typical influence would be you graduate from high school and you go to college, right? Non-normative influence would be things that were unusual. The whole COVID bit, that's non-normative influence. That doesn't happen very often, right? Or a war, or 9/11, or a flood. If you lived in, New Orleans, those would be non-normative. So researchers would anticipate seeing effects, right? Seeing a different process of coming of age for people who experience as non-normative. So it's usual versus unusual. Another term you might hear, and actually the term that I heard before I ever heard non-normative, was something called off time. And off time simply means that something is, like, it's a typical, a normative age-graded event. This is a normal event, like getting married, but you do it in a time that's not normal. So today that would be getting married at 18. It's normal, right, to get married, but in 2020, that would be considered very early, right? The average age, the average age of first marriage in 2020 is 24 for girls and 26 for boys. So that means if you're getting married at 18, that's not normative for 2020. Now, in 1965, 66, when my mother got married, that was very normal, right? That was a very typical. Then if you weren't married at 25, you were an old lady, right? So it's historically graded. Then you have a, say, normative history graded influence. So that would be things that are everyone in your culture experienced, because they all came through history at the same time. A war, a depression, 9/11, COVID. Those would be normative history graded influences. They're very unusual, and we're all at different stages in our life. So it's going to have a different effect on young children. Like, I live in Manhattan, and you see all these college kids, and they're still out. They're pretty much, well, they were going out to the bars till the city closed the bars down. And then you have something referred to as a historical generation. And that would be, if you've ever heard the phrase, the greatest generation. The greatest generation, I think they're about 90 now. That was a generation of young men who went to the Second World War, right? When they were young men. And so they all are coming of age with the same historical event. And this is what historians write about, is how that affected, how this whole generation of people has a different attitude. Another one that there's been a lot of research done on are people that came of age during the Depression. And we see patterns there are different patterns of behavior associated with people who come of age at a certain generation. I'll use myself as an example. So I'm 48 years old. I graduated high school in 1990. I belong to the generation that carries more consumer debt. We have more credit cards. We have more charge accounts than any other generation in American history, right? Well, that was normal. We came of age in the late 80s when we all graduated from high school. Everybody was making a lot of money. When I went to college, they were literally giving us a t-shirt and a credit card application at the same time. Myself and friends, we had a stack of credit cards like this. We all did. It was what everybody did. My daughter's generation, they're petrified of credit cards, right? They've come of age of a different time. Another example would be the AIDS crisis, right? In the 70s, free love, man, everybody's having sex with everybody. By the time the generation, that would have graduated high school in like 95, for instance, they were less sexually active, certainly than the generation that graduated in 1980, because they had AIDS. And so there's this historical event. It changes a whole generation of people, right? That's what that means when I talk about historical graded. I just think it's, when you hear conflict, when you hear old people and young people, and they talk about how, this generation's different. Well, yeah, the world is different, right, than it was before. My daughter's generation, she's 20, have been at war in the Middle East her whole life. And that other generations don't say that. Okay, you probably, if you have young people in your home, probably have young people who have had a cell phone, like they've always known cell phones. I still remember when they were on a wall and you had to dial. Okay, moving on. Other couple things to talk about here before I wrap this one up are things called a critical period and a sensitive period. So also in your textbook, somewhere around page 14 or 15, they're talking about, they use the imprinting, and it's a classic example of, when the duck hatches and he sees a human and he follows him around. And that refers to something called a critical period. The idea is that there are certain stages in our development, in our biological and our cognitive development, that we're more responsive to environmental influences. This is what refers to as sensitive. That if you're going to learn something, it's going to be particularly easy for you to learn it now. The best example I can think of is language. Researchers tell us that if you have learned a language by the time you are 5 years old, you will be able to speak that language as a native learner, as a native speaker. So, people, bilingual households would teach their children multiple languages, and then those children can just what we call code switch. They can just go back and forth between languages and it won't sound. If I was to learn a second language, I would always sound like a second language learner. I would always have this accent. You would know that I don't speak Spanish or French as a first language because language is considered to be responsive to a sensitive and a critical period. Trying to think of some of the others. Some of the others that I'm aware of are like bicycle riding, that somewhere around 12 or 13, if a child if they have not learned, and that's not as much about biology as it is about social, that because, well, at least in my time, riding a bicycle was part of what you did in the neighborhood. I'm trying to think of some of the others, but language is a big one. We'll talk more about some of those later on. Another word in here that's suggested is something referred to as plasticity. Yes, plasticity right here. It's also in your textbook. And this is a really important concept. It no doubt will show up on quizzes. What does plasticity mean? Think of plasticity as like plastic. Your brain, your neurological system is considered a plastic system. It is malleable. It can be molded. It is not steel. It is not fixed. But with certain inputs, it can be modified. So your brain is plastic. It can change in response to inputs or the environment or lacking. Okay, I'm going to wrap this one up here. And the last one I want to talk about the very broad scope, or what's the lifespan developmental approach.